Right now, Substack is in the middle of releasing the series that I wrote on why GLP writers write so differently. And I've already written it all. It's already in the queue, as well as an episode of a video episode, an epilogue. And so when I finished recording that epilogue, I genuinely thought I had reached the end of the conversation. The series had been an attempt to answer a question that has occupied me for years. Not simply why do autistic Gestalt language processors write? What do people write? The question was much more specific. Why do so many Gestalt writers seem to develop such distinctive voices? Why do we return to ideas rather than leaving them behind? Why do we circle back? Add another relationship, another layer, another quarter turn, rather than moving neatly from one completed thought to the next. And across that series, I argued that this is not simply a matter of style. It's not about preferring long sentences, unusual vocabulary, or complicated metaphors. It's not an aesthetic choice. It reflects something deeper about the organization of meaning itself. For many Gestalt processors, language arrives after experience, not before it. Writing becomes an act of progressively finding forms capable of carrying wholes that already exist. That kind of produces a particular architecture. Writing becomes recursive rather than linear. Earlier work is not discarded, it's revisited. Previous ideas are not replaced. They become more complete. In the epilogue I described, I've done it already, but it's not yet out. I describe this as returning rather than repeating. The old work remains true. It simply becomes insufficient. New relationships appear. New pressures enter the field. Something that had been quietly waiting finally becomes visible. That was where I thought the series ended. Then, Substack introduced AI detection. And quite by accident, the series became an experiment. Before I explain what happened, I need to make a disclosure. And I think you should know this by now, but as an older adult, 55, with a diagnosis of ASD, with level 2 support needs around language and pragmatics and all of that stuff, I don't think I need to say, but I will say, language has never been effortless for me. I came to literacy very late. Assistive technology has been a part of how I access the written words, how I write words, and how I conduct my research for years. Increasingly, that technology is AI enabled. Acrobat Pro has it. Snagit has it. Notebook LM, now part of Gemini, has it. My school's research library, the search interface uses it. Even my iPhone search uses it, whether we realize it or not. Very few of us now use technology that is not AI assisted in some way. I've always been open about my struggles and about the tools that help me participate. When schools or employers have questioned my need for accommodation, I have documentation from my physician, a psychiatrist, describing my diagnosis and the support needs that make these technologies not a shortcut, but an accessibility tool. So yes, I use a great deal of technology. None of this thinks for me. None of it struggles alongside me whilst I search for words that fit what I already know. None of it lives my life. None of it remembers my childhood. None of it teaches my students. None of it carries the archive from which all of this writing emerges. Technology helps me reach language. It does not replace the mind reaching for it. And that distinction matters because AI detection systems do not observe how a piece was written. They do not watch a person think. They do not see someone revise a sentence 20 times, lose a word, find it again, use speech to text, listen back, cut a paragraph, restore it, or sit with an idea for 30 years before finally becoming able to say it. They infer authorship from statistical patterns in the finished text. That is a very different thing. When that inference becomes a proxy for authenticity, disabled writers may be placed in the position of having to defend not only the tools that grant them access, but sometimes their own minds. Accessibility should not come with a presumption of suspicion. Still, I did not begin with outrage. I began with curiosity. Before I became a teacher, I spent over 2 decades working in digital and multimedia forensics. Method validation was part of everyday life. When a new analytic tool arrived, the question was never simply whether it worked. The question was, under what conditions does it fail? What are its false positives? What are its false negatives? What assumptions does it make about the world? And what lies just outside the domain on which it was validated? And so I did what any forensic scientist would do. I tested it. The first piece I submitted was one of my own essays. It was entirely human written. More than that, it was autobiographical. It described my own experience of becoming a writer as an autistic Gestalt language processor. The AI detector returned 100% AI. I assumed something was wrong. Perhaps the formatting, perhaps it was punctuation, perhaps it was the way the text had been pasted in the editor. So I changed one thing, only one, and still 100% AI. I changed another, still 100% AI. And as the hours ticked by, I stopped trying to persuade the detector and started running tests. Each test was designed to remove one possible explanation. I changed punctuation. No difference. I altered segmentation of sentences. No change. I added reflective interruptions, digressions. No change. I changed my UK English spelling to American spelling. No change. Made the prose more concrete. No change. I added contradictions and informality. No change. I wrote in a more spoken register. No change. I changed the structure, adding headings, lists, citations. No change. I replaced the subject matter with forensic content from my earlier life, whilst retaining the underlying rhetorical architecture. No change. I rewrote the Gestalt processing content in the style of an older forensic article that the detector have already accepted as human. No change. I typed the text manually into a fresh draft rather than pasting it. No change. Every version came back 100% AI. At that point, I needed controls. So I submitted 2 articles that I had written years ago on my old blog, Forensic Photoshop. It's at Blogspot if you want to find it. Both were immediately classified as 100% human. Now, that was useful. I meant the detector was not simply rejecting everything I had written. Then I submitted a passage from Virginia Woolf. Long sentences, abstract thought, literary prose, pasted text, again, 100% human. So now I had something more interesting than a single bad result. The detector could recognize unquestionably human writing. It could recognize my older human writing. It was simply not recognizing this particularly contemporary register. I then tested another piece. It was not about Gestalt language processing. It was an auto-theoretical epilogue involving friendships, queer relationality, graph theory, topology, pseudomathematics, recursive care, and the comments. Different subject, different genre, different structure. Again, 100% AI. Then I designed what I call a quarter turn test. The first half used an ordinary explanatory prose. The second half moved into original conceptual synthesis. The topic remained the same, vocabulary remained similar, the tone remained stable. The only discursive function changed from explaining existing knowledge to generating a new distinction. No change, 100% AI. By then I was beginning to wonder whether the detector was responding not to the subject matter, but the way of organizing meaning. I then received the clearest contrast in my entire study. I had written a short statement this morning on notes about AI, disability, assistive technology, authorship, accessibility. The piece was personal. Again, it was written this morning. It was first person. It disclosed my diagnosis, just like I did in the beginning of this piece. It described my use of AI-enabled tools, again, just like the beginning of this talk. It defended disabled writers against the presumption that access technology is evidence of fraud. It was written by the same person on the same platform at roughly the same time about almost exactly the same subject. I pasted it into a fresh Substack article, and the result was 100% human. That changed the study again, because now the detector was not merely distinguishing between my older and my newer writing. It was distinguishing between two registers I use now. It recognized me when I wrote directly and argumentatively. It recognized me when I established a position, explained the stakes, anticipated an objection, and defended a conclusion. It recognized me writing about AI, about disability, about disclosing my use of assistive technology. It recognized me defending my own authorship. What it did not recognize was the recursive, auto-theoretical register at the center of the series. The register that returns rather than advances. The register that allows an entire claim to remain true whilst becoming insufficient. The register that develops through relation, reclassification, metaphor, recursion, and quaternions. The register that comes out of my head as I'm yelling at my notes. And it's recording me, and I try to preserve it as whole as possible. That's an important distinction. It weakens explanations based on topic. It weakens explanation based on disability, based on first-person voice, based on contemporary authorship. It even weakens the idea that the detector is simply suspicious of anyone openly discussing AI assistance. It recognized that piece as human. The contrast now seemed to point towards register, not necessarily one feature, not necessarily sentence length, metaphor abstraction, or rhythm by itself, or perhaps some interaction between them and among them. Some way that meaning is organized across the whole text. And then I remembered the video. A while ago, I had recorded the epilogue for the current series, Why GLP's Writers, right? Why they write so differently. I had the transcript. Right? I can download that from Substack. Right? I can go into the podcast and I can click on transcript and it will download a text copy. So that's not an essay. That's not a polished article. It's a transcript of me talking like I'm doing right now. Thinking aloud, repeating myself, correcting myself, changing direction mid-sentence. The transcript still contained all the disfluencies. It still contained the self-corrections. It still contains transcription errors. Those little asides as well that occur when a person is speaking rather than composing. And at one point I interrupt myself and say, Jamie, you gobshite. And I left that in. I only removed the timestamps. I didn't rewrite it. And then smooth it into a prose. I didn't correct the rhythms of speech. I just pasted it into a brand new Substack article. And the result was 100% AI. That was a kicker. Because this is no longer polished writing. It's not the result of careful editing is no literary finish. It's not the suspicious smoothness people often associate with generated text. It was speech-derived language with repetitions, false starts, self-interruptions, recognition errors, and visible human mess. It was me talking about returning to my old books, about writing as recursion, about books as temporary settlements rather than destinations, about the archive continuing to speak to itself, about leaving language for a future version of me to find, about being tempted to rewrite everything and then calling myself a gobshite for it. The transcript contains all of that movement, contains the claim that I'm not repeating myself, I'm returning. That repetition circles whilst recursion descends. And it was classified as entirely artificial. And that was the moment I knew I was no longer testing writing alone. I was testing language architecture across modalities. The argumentative accessibility piece passed as human. The recursive spoken transcript has failed as AI. Same author, me. Same platform, Substack. Same broad period, within a few weeks. Different organization of discourse. That is a far cleaner contrast than any punctuation test could provide. As a forensic scientist, this matters. Not because it proves the detector is useless, it does not. And not because it proves that all autistic writing will be misclassified, it does not. It matters because a replication changes the status of an observation. A single false positive can be dismissed as anomaly. A false positive that survives control perturbation becomes a reproducible finding. A false positive that appears across multiple independently produced texts becomes harder to dismiss. A false positive that generalizes from composed prose to speech-derived language becomes cross-modal. And a detector that accepts one contemporary register from the same author whilst rejecting another gives us a within-author contrast. That's not proof of a mechanism, but it's enough to identify a serious research question. So naturally, I began reading Pangram's technical material. The system is not one of the older detectors based primarily on perplexity or burstness. It's a supervised transformer classifier. Big words. It uses hard negative mining. Again, what does that mean? The developers deliberately identify human texts as the model finds they find difficult. They generate synthetic mirrors matched in topic, genre, and layout, and retain the system on those difficult cases. Well, that's kind of a serious approach. In fact, it's specifically designed to reduce the kinds of false positives I had just documented. Pangram and several third-party evaluations report extremely low false positive rates on medium to long passages. In some benchmark tests, they reported the rate is close to zero. Those findings may be entirely accurate for the data sets on which they were measured. But not every validation claim has a boundary. The question is not only how well the system performed, the question is, on what? The benchmark domain described in Pangram's materials includes student writing, reviews, scientific writing, creative writing, books, encyclopedias, news, emails, scientific papers, short-form questions and answers. What I did not see explicitly identified was first-person auto-theoretical writing by autistic adults examining their own cognition. I did not see the language of late literate Gestalt processors. I do not see speech-derived reflective language from disabled adults whose relationship with language has developed through assistive technology. That does not prove those forms were absent. The published descriptions may simply not identify them. But if they were not adequately represented in the sample, then perhaps my work did not defeat the detector. Simply, perhaps it wandered beyond the edge of the validated map. And that possibly matters far beyond me. Substack's detector is presented in the language of authentication, and that word carries weight. Authentication does not sound like probability estimate. It sounds like confirmation. It sounds like the system can distinguish the real from the manufactured. But the detector doesn't authenticate authorship, it classifies text. These are not the same act. A detector cannot tell you whether I wrote a passage. It can only tell whether the passage resembles the forms of human and machine writing it learned during training. When those categories are treated as identity judgments, the burden shifts to the writer. The machine produces a probability. The disabled person is asked to produce a defense. That's not a neutral arrangement. It creates an accessibility barrier. Some neurodivergent writers naturally produce language that falls outside of conventional linguistic norms. Others rely on AI-enabled assistive tech, already embedded through ordinary software. Many do both. A detector, therefore, may place them under suspicion for the tools they use, the language they produce, or simply the structure of the mind producing it. And the result from my accessibility statement makes that even clearer. The detector recognized the conventional arguments. It recognized the disclosure and defense structure. It recognized the op-ed register. What it rejected was not the presence of disability or technology. It rejected consistently a less common way of organizing thought. That does not prove Pangram has discovered Gestalt processing. No, it has not. And it doesn't prove the classifier knows what is seen. It almost certainly does not. But it may have learned a boundary that treats one relatively rare form of human discourse as belonging on the artificial side. That is what now needs investigation. So as a wee school teacher, I care that people are properly supported. My school district has a private GPT instance for teachers. I know colleagues who use it for quick lesson ideas. I have written openly about how you use the technology to support a wide range of students. To me, that is what assistive technology is for. Not replacing human thought, helping more people participate in work that matters. So the ethical question is not whether technology has touched the process. Technology touches nearly every process now. The question is what work that technology performed, what work the person performed, and whether the resulting judgment respects the person's access needs, authorship, and agents. Substack for me is not a place where I manufacture content for engagement. I'm not trying to turn attention into a living. Substack is where I store my scripts. It is where I house my script gardens. That people subscribe, that you subscribe, paid or free, or follow along. That makes me smile, it really does. It lets me feel connected, and I am genuinely grateful. But it remains, first of all, a storage medium for language I have fought hard to reach. That is why the detector's judgment feels so strange. It looks at language that took me decades to access and calls it synthetic. It looks at the visible record of an autistic woman finding language late and reports that no human mind likely has made it. Even when the text is a transcript of that woman talking. Even when she hesitates, even when she corrects herself, even when she wanders, even when she says, Jamie, you gobshite. I want to be careful about what I claim. I'm not claiming that AI detectors can identify AI-generated writing. I'm not claiming that Pangram's published benchmarks are fraudulent. I'm not claiming that my experience generalizes to all autistic people, all Gestalt processors, all disabled writers. I have one authenticated author, myself. What I have is something smaller and more scientifically useful. A reproducible set of false positives. Multiple independently produced human texts. Multiple genres, multiple topics, written and spoken language. Older forensic writing accepted as human. Contemporary argumentative disability state accepted as human. Recursive auto-theoretical language consistently classified as artificial. 25 years ago, I would have called that the beginning of a validation study, and I think it still is. The series, Why GLP Writers Write So Differently, asked what happens when human language architecture exists before the surrounding theory has learned how to recognize it. This experiment may be another version of the same question. What happens when we train a machine to recognize human writing but fail to include the full range of ways human minds organize meaning? What happens when a conventional argument is accepted as human, but recursive language drawn from lived experience is not? And what happens when statistical normality becomes a test of authenticity? What happens when access tools become evidence of suspicion? And who is required to prove that their own mind is real? So yes, I use technology. I will continue to use technology. I will continue to use the tools that give me access to reading, to writing, to teaching, to research. None of them thinks for me. None of them lives the language for me. None of them struggles to find words for a life already lived. And none of them should become the measure against which the reality of my authorship is judged. If someone feels the need to run my scripts through AI detection tool before deciding whether or not they count as mine, They need not waste their time. They may simply unsubscribe or unfollow. The archive will remain. The script garden will remain. And I will keep writing because, not because a classifier has recognized me as human, because I am. So thank you. Have a good day.